All right. Well, we are going to jump right into it. I'm excited to do this episode because if you've been following my content for long, you know that at the start of 2026, or at the start of the year, I do a bit of a predictions episode, and then I do a mid-year check-in and an end-of-year check-in. And we are mid-year. So if you don't remember, at the beginning of 2026, I framed 2026 as the year that would potentially be the AI hangover, where after reckless and kind of uncoordinated tech binges from the end of 2022 through 2025, companies would start waking up and having to nurse the massive headache and clean up their environments and start shifting towards some strategic surgical refinement with what they were doing with tech. Well, we're at the mid-year mark for 2026, and the general premise of the prediction was dead on, including a lot of the subpoints in there. But the exact how of how those things have played out is quite the story that I want to touch on, because the pacing of the friction and the fallout of some of this in some cases has moved faster. In other cases, it hasn't moved quite as fast. So we're going to talk about that. And in many cases, we're going to talk about how many organizations are doing a lot more than just nursing a headache. They are staring at massive property damage, massive bills, and in many cases realizing the cleanup of this AI hangover is a pretty significant operational lift. So in short, the hype has hit the brick wall. Boards, leaders, even individuals now are kind of starting to push back on these big promises and demanding to see, hey, where is this really going? So at January, we predicted a bit of a hangover. By July, companies are not just hungover, they're looking at some pretty big bills for tech that they may not have even realized they signed up for, and certainly are not 100% sure how to use effectively at this point. But before we get into it, I'm Christopher Lind. This is Future Focused. If you like this style, if you like this content, it would mean the world to me to like, share, comment, do all those great things to help get this out to people who would benefit from it. If you want to formally support or engage with me, you can go to buymeacoffee.com or check out christopherlin.co. You can see the advisory consulting work I do in this space, because I care deeply about this, because there is absolutely a world. I just recently published an article about some of the big wins. It is totally possible to win for all parties involved with this, but it requires care and attention. And if you don't, the consequences are heavy. So with that, let's get into this. The structure of this is I'm going to just do a brief recap on what I touched on at the beginning of the year and then break down where we are. And then I'll close out the session with, so what do we do? Where do we go from here? So the first prediction I had to do with what I predicted was going to be some pretty significant backlash against AI coming into it. You know, as people were waking up from the AI party, I thought, you know what, we're going to see some things, and moving from maybe a little bit of skepticism mixed with some excitement to downright revolt. And with that, I anticipated there might also come with it some real legal and regulatory accountability, because AI keeps receipts, and as much as we think it's a black box, it's not. And so all of this I thought would maybe turn into some, witch hunts, some regulatory crackdown, and all this other stuff. Where we are so far this year, the legal system and the administration, the political administration, and I don't think this is just a US thing, I think globally, I'm seeing this around the world, isn't quite there when it comes to accountability. I think the gap between kind of the ownership and responsibility and the accountability for what's being responsible and being done is not where it needs to be. The regulatory bodies are still very slow on this. While there are some legal things popping up here and there, it hasn't fully been baked in, and there's been a lot of effort to kind of slow any of those things. Now, to be clear on that, though, that doesn't mean the bodies aren't piling up. It doesn't mean the real harm and kind of chaos that is coming from some of this stuff isn't happening. And you don't have to look very far through the headlines to see some of the serious things that are coming on both a personal, on an organizational, on just a societal level. AI is having a massive impact on that. Now, with that, one of the things that I think is that was very much true to this anti kind of AI sentiment that I saw starting to build at the beginning of the year is that one, while the legal and kind of regulatory side of things have been slower to move to close the gap in accountability than I had thought and actually kind of hoped, what has sprung into full swing is the public anti-AI sentiment. This is coming from all sides. You have public uproar over the environmental footprint of these data centers as it relates to water usage, as it relates to greenhouse gases, as it relates to drain on the electric grid, And while the data center rollout has been slower, the public backlash against what is in place, a lot of that slowdown has been the result of backlash amid some other things. There is a lot of anti-AI sentiment happening, and it's happening with employees who are pushing back against employers. What's interesting is even the AI companies now are backing down from these promises of, oh, AI is going to take away all human labor, as they're seeing the public sentiment just explode against anti-AI. This year we've seen protests, we've seen people sawing down flock cameras, we've seen people, going to great lengths to shut down some of these AI companies. And so there's, in many cases, what I'm seeing right now at the mid-year mark, which is a little bit, I think, unfortunate, and I'll explain why, is I'm seeing people start to split into extremism and hostile camps, almost kind of turf wars, as people are digging into their holes of they're either anti-AI or they're pro-AI, and they're lobbing grenades at each other. And you've got your hyper skeptics over here versus these blind accelerationists. And the pressure is to kind of commit. Are you in or are you out with AI? Which I think is actually really, really unfortunate, because what I'm seeing is throughout society, and I just had something happen last week where, I posted about AI and its usage in recruiting and hiring, and just use this backlash of polarization explode through this. And what is happening is people are very quickly screaming and shouting and pointing fingers at the wrong thing. People are screaming at the technology itself. They're treating AI as if it's this active villain, which actually distracts from the very thing I talked about just a little bit ago, which is the real issue, which is these organizations, these leaders who are making decisions about how AI is built, how it is being deployed, how it is being used, and the lack of governance around this. And so I think this is actually something we need to be really mindful of. And I do a lot of my work to try and bring people back together to say, hey, like, I understand why people are frustrated, they're upset. I understand why there's a lot of this backlash around it. I completely see it. But we need to be really careful that our solution to that isn't to scream at an autonomous technology that is literally only doing what it is being instructed to do by the people who ultimately are overseeing it. Now, I understand sometimes the response to that is, well, I'm not telling AI to do it, it's someone else. True, but that's kind of my point. Someone somewhere is making these decisions, and instead of going directly to that person and saying, hey, you need to be held accountable for these decisions, and we either need to fix this or correct it or change course, we're screaming at the AI. And again, that's where then the AI accelerationists, either they understand it differently or sometimes they're just still a little blind to it. They're like, that's not right. And so it ends up in these just really fruitless arguments over something that is, it's a machine predictive algorithm is what it is. And I get there's a lot more complexity to it and the way it works and how these decisions are being made. But I think this is actually one of the areas where the prediction was accurate. How it's playing out is, especially around the anti-AI sentiment, is not only moving faster, but I feel like we're missing the mark on it. And I think some of that is because of how slow we're being on the legal and regulatory accountability to it. And so because people feel like nothing's happening, they're just getting frustrated with the tech. So that's where we are right now. I'm really interested to see how this plays out through the end of the year. And if you're listening to this and if you feel yourself drifting towards one of these two camps, I would encourage you to not to push back against that, because really what I'm seeing across the board is what AI is doing and how effective it is and the harm it's causing or the good it's causing is really not with the technology itself. And I get there may be factors outside of your control, but it still is not the technology itself. So I'll stop there, but that would just be my encouragement. If you can be someone who doesn't lean into this drift, and we could get to the end of 2026, because we don't need yet another thing to be tearing each other over that actually doesn't address the real problem at hand and instead just leaves us screaming and yelling at each other and not accomplishing anything. So that was prediction 1 and what we thought and where we are. Prediction 2, I talked about the invisible AI. And what I meant by that was I predicted in 2026, we were going to start to see AI move into this invisible state where it became more integrated into the background. And we were going to see, and some of that was tied to wearables. There was a lot of hype around the wearables early in 2026, things like that. And there was this need for world data of like, how do things actually work? We've got all these models that's based on static data, but what's actually happening in the world, and how do we, analyze all of that stuff? And so I thought we were going to see more of this invisible wearable push and AI fade more into the background. In some ways, this absolutely has happened. The one way it has not is that the physical backlash, and this is one where I see a lot of, I will just say, cognitive disconnect. In some ways, it's not, or it hasn't gone invisible. So as an example, and this ties a bit to the backlash, AI glasses. Okay, you want to talk backlash to AI. There is a perfect example of that has just not gone well. People were called glass holes if they wore, AI glasses. And so that has not been adopted well. And there's kind of a stigma associated if you get caught with AI glasses type of a thing. So in one sense, people are really upset and they're pushing back against this. So it hasn't quite gone invisible. And the same thing with flock cameras. People are really upset by these flock cameras and they're, cutting them down and they're risking potentially going to jail, getting arrested over this stuff. So some of those things that looked like, hey, maybe this will start to go invisible, we won't see it as much, is definitely not doing a good job of cloaking what it's doing. And people are going, I see you, I'm not okay with you, I'm going to push back. And that backlash in some cases has really led to things not going invisible. But where the cognitive disconnect comes into play is, in some cases, it also has, in, I would argue, some very dangerous ways. So while people might be getting really angry about, Meta's glasses or flock cameras in their neighborhood, people are also becoming more dependent on AI models with more sensitive personal data than they really ever have been. And, I see this in what are the AI use cases that are catching the most steam. And it has to do with people talking to it, as a therapist, or people talking to it as a friend to help be a brainstorming partner, or, them loading all of their kind of intelligence and having it plan their day, plan their week, all this other stuff. So in some ways, I don't know that I would say that's invisible, but in some ways, the way it's influencing and the effect that it's having on people is starting to fade into the background, but in ways I don't think people necessarily see. And so if you follow my Substack, you will see a couple of weeks ago, I wrote about the slow erosion of human agency as people are leaning on AI to, come up with something for me to react to. What do you think about this? And I'll just kind of make a decision on it, not realizing that AI is narrowing their focus. It's framing things for them. So you're just kind of choosing good enough instead of actually thinking critically about what we need to do. So when I say there's this cognitive dissonance, there is, in the sense that on some things, people are very outspoken and AI is not going invisible, and people are determined to not let it kind of bleed into our lives. And then yet on the same hand, we're also integrating it into things that I really thought we would be far more resistant to, or we would start to go, yeah, I don't really like where this is going. And largely, I think that has some real implications that we have to watch out for, that I will continue to be not only tracking, but drawing attention to as we do this. And again, just another one of these things to consider, as I'm watching the track. On one hand, people are really uncomfortable with, say, a set of AI glasses that's recording video and tracking all of this stuff and pulling in audio. Yet it's also becoming more normative that people have, AI devices that they're using to take notes, voice notes and things like, and all their meetings are recorded and all this other stuff. So in some ways we're moving along and things are going invisible. In some ways they aren't. But I am consistently seeing a dangerous trend towards handing over our agency. It's just not in the nefarious Hollywood way that I think some people are watching out for. And so when I made this prediction, that was one of the things I was concerned about, was it would do a little bit of sleight of hand, and we would think we're being resistant to it while actually adopting it in ways without fully understanding how this is influencing and affecting us. So something, again, I'm watching very closely, and will be interested to see how this continues, especially when you combine this with the bit of polarization. Because one last thing on this point, and then I'll move to point 3, is it's interesting how even the people with some of the strongest anti-AI sentiment, people's definition for unacceptable AI tends to be things I don't use it for, and not me, Christopher. Like, people look at things like, I don't use it for that, so therefore that's a wrong way to use it. Oh, this thing over here, no, I think that's a great way to use it. Well, why do you think that? Well, because it really helps and benefits me. And there's not really an objective measure to, is this helpful or harmful for a lot of people, even your anti-AI folks. I know some folks who are extremely anti-AI, but then when I talk with them about it, they're like, well, I do use it for this, and I use it for this because I see it adds value in that. And again, it goes back to some of this cognitive dissonance that we just need to be really mindful of. And I think this is why having clear standards, and I think I will continue to say there is a need for some regulatory oversight and governance around this stuff that is agnostic to the individual, collective, personal preference. I think that's one of the biggest risks right now, is what's good versus what's bad seems to pretty much be largely left up to whatever anybody thinks in the moment. And that's a dangerous place for us to be. Okay, so point 3. The prediction 3 that I mentioned at the beginning of the year was, I thought, in addition to 2026 being the year of the AI hangover, I said it's also going to be the year of work slop. And I predicted that there was going to be just an influx of digital mediocrity, automated bugs as we started vibe coding more and more things. And people were just going to start confusing high AI output. We're generating so much more stuff. Things seem to be happening so much faster, and things are starting to move quicker, and look how much more we've created. But there's a bit of an agentic and AI just in general letdown, where we're looking at all this activity and saying, yeah, but I don't know, is this really what we thought? And coming into 2026, there still was a lot of hype around the fact that AI would eliminate the need for people. Well, we're mid-year in 2026, and here's what we can say. Work slop is absolutely something that is crushing organizations, as more and more people are generating more stuff and using AI to generate stuff. And it's also fueling some of this anti-AI sentiment, where people are like, I am sick of getting AI generated emails or seeing a PowerPoint deck that clearly AI created. My pushback to this is your frustration that AI created it, or is it the fact that it says a lot of words and says a lot of things but doesn't say anything at all? And that goes back to, people don't necessarily have an objective measure. And I think that's one of the risks with work slop right now, is people are frustrated when they perceive AI without really saying, well, what are you actually mad about? Are you mad about the fact that AI was used because you pushed all of this for employees to do more, to use AI for everything, and yet you're pushing back on it, is it due to quality? And I think that's one of the things we're seeing. But I think one of the other things we're seeing is that, work slop is kind of this natural output of the mediocrity of some of this stuff. And more people are starting to realize, hey, more is not necessarily better. And agentic AI is definitely not delivering on the promise of, hey, you're not going to need people. In fact, I've been following some research recently, and I'm not going to say all, but a large majority of companies who bet big on AI in terms of replacing or dramatically reducing their need for human labor, they're all backing this out. I just posted about Ford is rehiring this. A lot of these companies that made these big, bold, air quote, moves with AI, they're backing up on this. And this is, especially compounded, and this is a big one in mid-year 2026. Many organizations are getting the 1-2 punch with the financial hit of AI and the cost of tokens. A lot of these SaaS platforms that integrated all of this AI functionality going, hey, let's get this in, let's get this on everybody's thing. They started getting hit with the token and the API costs, which then now is getting passed along to organizations who just kind of turned a lot of this functionality on without a whole lot of strategic thought or oversight. And they're quickly realizing like, whoa, our terms and conditions changed. We've got all this stuff. We don't have a clear insight into our tech stack. We're paying more than we thought. Anthropic, which I'll talk about later, has now grown in popularity, but also significantly in expense. And so a lot of these companies are finding major financial ramifications for what they did, in many ways going, well, we'll just go down this path and we'll figure it out later. And that later is costing them big time. But that's combined with the lack of direction and AI effectiveness that was provided, in terms of support for employees. In many cases, it was just handed to them. Hey, here, do this. In some cases, the company didn't even support it. It was just an expectation. Everybody had their own little AI tech stack. Then companies started adopting it and said, do more with it, do all this stuff without a whole lot of direction. And so I'm even running into issues. One of the most notable ones, you want to talk work slop. There was one organization where one of their folks spun up an $80,000 vibe coded brain rot app. And they were so taken back by this, they kind of tried to turn it into a PR stunt to try and, recoup some of the losses on this. And this is just, again, the natural side effect of implementing powerful, expensive technology like this with little foresight, little thought for this, little preparation for the people, and in many cases, just not caring or treating people like they are their most important asset. And so people are like, well, I'm just going to do what I need to do. And we're seeing that mid-year. It is happening over and over and over. I can't tell you how many days I hear from somebody or come across another thing where somebody got hit with an invoice they weren't anticipating. They uncovered some shadow AI work that was happening, or they are about to blow a gasket over some of the work slop or just complete AI nonsense that's happening in their organizations. I think the other thing is the ecosystems are just becoming infinitely complex, as going back to my point about how all these SaaS platforms all added new AI functionality, a lot of it duplicative to other AI systems, and everybody just turned this stuff on. And so just as an example, we'll just use this as an example. People now are having transcriptions of meetings taken by 5 different AI systems that then get stored in 5 different locations, transferred across 5 different things. And so again, then as the cost of this AI starts tuning up, people are going, well, what do we even have? What do we need? Where is it going? I worked with an organization recently where they're like, well, we have Gong that's doing this, but then we also have Claude that's pulling from this. And then some of that's getting pulled into Salesforce, but Salesforce has its own AI that's doing this other stuff. And all 3 are on a different billing clock. So this is where we are right now. And I don't say this to freak people out or go, oh no, like it's chaos. But I say this to say we're mid-year and we are right in the thick of this. And I would say we are only now just starting to discover some of how serious this is. And one of the warnings that I had at the beginning of the year was the problem with a lot of this AI stuff is everything looks good until it's not. And once it's not, you realize all the subfloor and the roof and like everything is completely rotted out. And you didn't know until everything started caving in. So my encouragement though for folks is I have talked to a number of recent folks who have said, I feel like I'm behind on this AI front. And one of the really encouraging things to those of you who may be listening to this is if you feel like you're behind, if you feel like maybe you should have been further along, I would actually say take a point of encouragement that if you were one of the companies that maybe said, hey, we want to maybe hold a little bit or maybe be a little more careful or surgical with what we do, you may be and most likely are in a better position. I think the risk you run right now is that you look at kind of where things are right now, you freak out and go, yeah, we're just going to stay away from AI. That would not be the wise decision, in my personal opinion. Now, I'm not saying blindly, recklessly run in. I'm just saying to join the anti-AI party and write it all off because you start hearing some of these doom and gloom stories, I don't think is the right approach, because alongside these doom and gloom stories, there's also some great successes that don't get enough airtime. But that is where we are as it relates to kind of the work slop epidemic that we predicted in 2026. We're in the slop. We're in the slop. That's for sure. And boy, is it some very expensive, messy, complicated slop that we've got to climb out of. So definitely work to do moving forward. But for those of you who maybe didn't jump into the mud pit right out of the gate, well, you know what? You're in a good spot. All right. So point number 4, prediction number 4 at the beginning of the year. I anticipated that through 2026, we were going to see some pretty big shakeups in the tech hierarchy in terms of who the big players would be. All of this just based on the data ecosystems, the different players and their lack of or strength in kind of business sustainability with what they were doing. And so at the beginning of the year, I thought Google was going to take on a much more dominant position. I predicted OpenAI would face some really serious fall from grace and Anthropic would quietly win based on ethics, which, you know, in some cases, we're seeing some of that. The layout of the board was fairly accurate looking back on where I was as I reviewed what I had laid out in the beginning of the year. But the financial realities, they're definitely telling a much harsher story. Now, Anthropic, I said at the beginning of the year, might really be the winner when it came to the ethical long game. Depending on who you talk to, that's up for debate. There are certain areas where they've definitely done some ethical theater. Whether or not it's legitimate depends on which report you're looking at and which contracts you actually are evaluating and the work that they're doing. But needless to say, from a capability standpoint, I would say Anthropic is definitely crushing things, especially with their Fable and Mythos that have come out. It was so advanced, they had to roll it back. But with that advancement came some heavy token costs, government safety concerns. And with that, even though technically from a capability standpoint, a lot of people are singing praises of Anthropic, but their path to profitability is still on shaky ground, would be my best assessment of this. They still do not have a clear path to actually understanding how to generate revenue from the notably incredible products that they're building, which I think is still their biggest risk. While they may have a large valuation, and if they ultimately go public, you know, who knows what'll happen with that. But that's not necessarily, that may slow the bleeding. I don't know that it may stop them completely bleeding out. But from a capability standpoint, they are kind of they're the AI group that everybody wants. You know, they're in the cool club right now as it stands, and many organizations are getting fully wrapped up in that. So that has held true, and we'll see where that goes. OpenAI has definitely OpenAI, and I would say Grok, even with XAI combining with SpaceX and then Elon going public and all this other stuff. I feel like OpenAI and Grok, they are shooting for the stars with their GPS coordinates locked right in on flying straight into the sun. Now, they have not burned up in the sun as of yet, but it is definitely interesting to watch. And it's been interesting to watch the players on the stage shift in and out of the spotlight on this one. OpenAI is definitely not performing where they were when they, initially kind of came out of the gate in the Gen AI movement. Grok is, again, depending on who you talk to, some people think it's the greatest thing ever. But when you look at the financial performance and its integration into the business sphere, giving them a path to profitability, I question whether, we'll see where they even go. Legacy, some of the legacy one, Microsoft, while they have, and this will tie into the Google Sleeper one, Microsoft still has a pretty heavy footprint, but that footprint I am seeing is largely tied to just the market share that they own as it relates to workplace and desktop. I don't know very many consumers at all who are using Copilot. So if you're talking consumer grade, I think Microsoft's just not a non-existent one. But because of their footprint in the business sphere, they're still chugging along. I don't know that I've talked to anybody at an organization that's using Copilot that just talks about their love for Copilot, but in many ways, people just love to dog on Microsoft for it, and I think it's largely just because Microsoft has tried to shove it down everybody's throat, and it's certainly not the most capable models and capable tools in the suite. It has its sweet spots. It's definitely capable of doing some things, but I think they've just overhyped it because it feels just like it's part of the tech ecosystem. People are less excited about it. And so I would say Microsoft's falling a little bit flat. Meta is... they are less than meh. If you want to say Microsoft and Copilot is meh, Meta is, they make Microsoft look like a frontier model. We'll just say that. But we'll see what happens as that one continues to progress. These things, and I'll talk a little bit about how things are going with this. Google, I still tag, and yes, some of this is because I do a lot of work on the Google ecosystem. Google, in my mind, is still one of the biggest underdogs that is being grossly underestimated. And I think that's largely influenced by the fact that, Microsoft has organizational market share. Microsoft is a dominant player when it comes to the corporate capabilities. The startups, they may be on Google, but they're all excited to use Claude because that's the cool thing. And if you're in the startup world, it's like having a Mac. You got to have a Mac. You can't use a PC. It's not cool. So everybody wants Claude Code and Claude Cowork. Not cool to use Gemini or Notebook LM, which I think is unfortunate because if most people knew what was possible, with the Google ecosystem, I think a lot of organizations, especially with some of the recent things, there's some majorly late-breaking shifts in the Google ecosystem that are extremely powerful that, again, I think are just grossly underestimated in terms of what people can and can't do with it. So I would still tag Google as the sleeper when it comes to this stuff. That's kind of where we are on. Now, I'll acknowledge that, there's other players out there. We haven't seen quite as much from DeepSeek as we maybe thought we would, some of these other Chinese models and things like that. And they're moving along. But that's kind of the update on the overall architecture of what's happening with that. We'll see where it goes. On the app side of things, I would say things are starting to simplify a bit. For a while, it felt a little bit like COVID, where everybody was spinning up a new app and there were 90 bajillion apps and you had subscriptions to 10 different meeting transcription tools. And then you had 15 others that were making your PowerPoint slides. And then you did all this other stuff. The app market definitely seems to be simplifying, seems to be consolidating a bit as that's coming together. And again, I think the wrapper app noise is dying. Hey, we've got this great app. Well, really, it's just a faceplate for this other frontier model. People are a little more aware of that. They're not as interested in having 32 AI subscriptions when really what they need is, a subscription to this and maybe a couple foundational apps and tools like that. So the mediocre tools I'm starting to see fade, which is important for startup folks to consider, because there was a point where you could make some big money vibe coding some app, calling it an AI app, going and schlepping it out to anybody who would sign up for it and make a pretty penny on it. And I think people are kind of waking up to it. People are figuring out, that vibe coded stuff I can do it myself. Why would I go pay for a subscription? I can manage that if I really need it. And so people are kind of solidifying into the more mature foundational apps on top of these frontier models. So we'll see what happens over time. Again, I'll be tracking these towards the end of the year and see where we land on this. And then the final major point that I made, which was really a combination of 5 and 6, was talking about, at the beginning of the year, I was really curious to see if we were going to continue on the hockey stick exponential growth curve in terms of model capability, or if we were going to flatline out a little bit. And then I did address kind of the humanoid robots and what was happening with that. My predictions were, I predicted at the beginning of the year that we were going to move into a bit of an iPhone stage where, some of the flattening of the innovation curve. Yes, there's a new model out. Yes, you see a press release about, OpenAI released this or Anthropic released this, but, largely everything was still what you thought it would be. And I would say that, is what I said there. And then I thought, with the humanoids, I did predict that our obsession with humanoid robots would start to fade a bit as we realized, I don't know that making a robot try and pretend to be a human is quite as important as, we think, if we really need a robot to do something, we should design it to be focused on what the robot needs to do, not try and mirror what a human is. Now, we're mid-year into 2026, and I will say largely the jaw-dropping, like, wow, this new model came out with this. It's like blowing my hair off. Not that I had hair, but those feel like they've faded. For a while there, if you were following this space, it felt like every new release was like, this is the latest and greatest. It's the best it's ever been. It's going to blow your mind. Now it feels more like you'll get an update and it'll be like, hey, we just released this. And everybody goes, okay, great. We got it. It's part of our subscription. Or, yeah, we're actually going to turn that off. We're not ready because the token cost on it is higher, or the reasoning model is just too complicated for what we really do. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that a lot of these AI models are vastly more capable than most people actually need. And I think this is part of where this backlash around what's going on with more data centers and push for more chips and advanced chips and all this other stuff. And I think people are kind of starting to go, hey, like, why are we pushing so hard for this? I don't feel like we're seeing exponential returns on the value. Now, the one exception to that, I will say, Anthropic's, Fable and Mythos, that one did have a pretty big wow factor with it. There's no denying it had a pretty big wow factor with it. I think the challenge with it is people quickly realized that in terms of sustainability and what it really could do, for the vast majority of people, it was, quite frankly, overkill. And so, sure, I mean, how many times can you vibe code a brand new app from scratch? How many times do you really need to completely transform your website type of a thing? How many times do you need to do a complete user experience overhaul of your app? Like that kind of stuff. Like, okay, it could do it much better. There were some very notable, and I don't want to diminish some of the wows that came with Anthropic's Fable and Mythos as it's continuing to go, and you're continuing to see this. But that really was kind of the big one. There's definitely some wow factors with other things, but it has not been what it was. And again, I think we're seeing things starting to flatten out here. We're seeing the curve flatten. Now, as for the humanoids, this one, I feel like there are some still very committed to this, definitely over in Asia. In the APAC and JPAC region, you're seeing a lot more around humanoid robotics. But I would say, even just in general, it does feel like, I'll just say this, it feels a little bit like we've got a hammer and we're looking for nails. It makes for great video shorts content. It's cool to see a robot punch somebody or punch a punching bag through a brick wall. Or, things like that where you're like, wow, look, it can do backflips. But wow, here's a real tangible thing we need this thing to do that can only be achieved in humanoid form. And so that's where it seems like now robotics is starting to move in more to built to form. If we needed to do this, let's actually engineer something that's designed to do that thing. And it probably doesn't look like a human. And trying to make it look like a human adds engineering challenges that are just, quite frankly, unnecessary. To make it perform like a human, we got to factor in a whole bunch of technology and capability that is just, quite frankly, not value add. Why don't we just build what we needed to do and build a form factor that's optimized for that? So I would say where we are right now, I'm not seeing or hearing anywhere near the kind of humanoid hype that we were at the beginning of the year, which we were on that trajectory at the beginning of the year. And that one continues to move at that pace. I think the other thing with that's been interesting is, the humanoid robotic piece has been riddled with scandals in many regards, and that, a lot of this, like, wow, look, these humanoids robots are doing this. It just kept coming out that it was like, oh, wait, there's somebody in another country that's actually operating this in a VR headset. Like, that's not really a humanoid robot doing this. And so then when you saw its performance compared to what was actually happening, it has not made it there. So the combination of scandals, and then humans are fascinating creatures, and they're very difficult to engineer to form. And so I think that's just slowing this one down significantly. Even when it comes to things like, everybody's worried about, AI robots doing military stuff. They are, but it's more like, how do we get drones to do this? How do we build, autonomous vehicles that can do this? Is there not like, how do we make a human that isn't actually a human to do this? It just isn't quite what you expected. The seventh and last one for this, and then I'll get into just kind of closing out with the, so what? So what do we do? Which I've touched on a little bit along the way, but there are 4 things that I really want to zone in on. At the beginning of the year, I predicted there was going to be a pretty significant talent pivot away from, there was, and it already was fading. You got to be good at prompting. It's all about mastering the prompts and figuring out how to prompt this and, getting all that right. And I predicted that was going to fade, and things were going to lean more towards, human capability, people understanding how to use AI effectively. We're mid-year. We're definitely, what I will say is, the promise that you need to go get a master's in prompt engineering, yeah, that's gone. And I anticipated that would really never catch fire. And it hasn't. People have quickly figured out, like, nah, we don't need people to take a PhD in prompting. There's almost just more this baseline expectation that using LLMs and generative AI is something that, is just a baseline expectation that people just need to know how to do. And so, and that's where we are right now. We're mid-year. Now, I think the problem with this is that organizations, people in general, they're just getting almost zero support in this. And so there's almost zero formal training, guidance, framework. Organizations were already really bad at saying, here's what we need you to do. Like, here's the desired outcome. Here's what you're held accountable to. Here's what needs to happen. We're just seeing more of that, but now people are like, okay, but now I have this AI stuff, and people are just kind of bumbling around a bit. And so I had said we needed to move towards more AI effectiveness instead of AI adoption. We're getting there. We are not where we need to be. So while we've made the move away from prompting as the master skill that you need to factor in, people are learning you're better off asking AI what kind of prompt you should ask, or it's just getting better at understanding what you're asking. You don't need that. Communication skills is becoming more important, but I think we just have not quite made the progress we need to on AI effectiveness, which for those of you who know me, who follow me, that's a big area of passion for me. And I think we seriously, not just because I specialize in it and I have services to support that, we need to, because going back to everything I just described, the outcomes people are getting with AI, whether they're good or destructive, is really dependent on how effective they are using the tech. And so anyway, so let's come into the home stretch, because there are 4 surgical leadership actions that on the conclusion, the check-in, and we'll see where we are at year end. I'll commit to doing a year end one. But as I look at now what, okay, so I made these predictions. Here's where we are at the halfway checkpoint. What are the most important things you as a user should, or as a leader, as an individual, what should you be doing? And the first one is, we got to stop buying new tools, more tools, better tools. We really have to shift to investing in human capability alongside AI, which means understanding systems thinking, understanding data literacy, understanding kind of AI capability and AI architecture, so that people understand, when do we use it, when do we not. And so when I say we need to focus on AI effectiveness, we really do. If we are going to change trajectory on some of the dark directions we're heading with things, and going back to what I said, there are people who are doing this right, and these are the 4 things I'm consistently seeing that differentiate the people who are winning versus the people who are struggling. And the biggest one is focusing on not just buying more tech, making the people you have better at the tech that you already own. That is numero uno. I would say that for every single company. I would say that to every single individual. Stop shopping the app store. Stop considering whether you need to go get the latest and greatest new tech model. Look at what you have and actually objectively assess how effective you are with it. So that would be number 1. Number 2, we've got to rebuild trust. Okay, if you have heard a thread throughout all of these points, we made big bets. Many people made big bets, foolish bets. I would go so far as to say, thinking AI was far more capable, people needed far less support, that really people weren't as unique and capable as we thought. Like, we're learning a lot of these lessons the hard way. And unfortunately, many people completely destroyed trust to learn these lessons. And some people still have not learned these lessons. And so, if anything, my second encouragement is, you need to believe in the value and capability of people. If you are still thinking to yourself, well, maybe AI at some point, maybe we're just not there yet. We're not going to get there. We're not going to get there. You need to truly value the people that you have, the people around you, and your human skills. You have to do that, and you have to start rebuilding trust with the people that you shattered it with. And like I said earlier, that doesn't mean throw AI out and say, hey, everybody, like, we're just going to go back to a non-AI world. No, that's not the wise move either. But now you need to take the time to go, hey, we learned some lessons, and you need to admit where you fell short. And you need to say, listen, we need to repair, we need to correct, we need to hear from you what's working, what's not, and we need to change course. And all those things that are required to build trust need to happen. And to some degree, I almost feel like you can move this to number 1, because if you don't have this, you're not going to move to stopping buying more tools and investing in humans, because you still don't value them. You don't value them and see the value in building trust with them. So maybe flip-flop these two. Either case, they're both mandatory for everybody everywhere. The third one is, you have to simplify and clean up the tech ecosystem you have. There are still lots of organizations who are just hoping that by switching to the next app, or adding more apps to the mix, or adding an AI layer. I see this all the time. Hey, we're just going to add an AI layer on top of our rat's nest of an ecosystem. You cannot skip this step. If you've been following my work for long, you know I recently launched the Helix project system, which was really all about this. It's like, hey, how do you simplify and clean up your ecosystem? How do you get out of the shackles of these complicated ecosystems that are tripping over each other and assuming that AI can somehow understand these noisy, messy systems? And so that means you need to take the time, you need to focus the attention, focus your priorities, and focus your dollars on simplifying. If you've got 13 apps that are doing the same thing, don't just go, wow, like we'll just turn this functionality up. Like, no, understand why that functionality is there, how it's being used, where it's being used, what you need to do, and can you consolidate? If so, do it. If not, why not? And then what function and features do you use as, this kind of stuff? And you need to do this because it's only going to get worse. It's only going to get more expensive. And I tell people this every single day. This stuff is going to get more expensive. It's going to get more complex. And kicking this can down the road is only adding insult to injury in this area. And this one is one that is starting to blow organizations up left and right. So ruthlessly focus on simplifying and cleaning up what you have before. If somebody comes and says, hey, we need a new app, you need to say, full stop. We're going to hold on that until we are sure we know that we actually need that app and that the capability that that app brings is adding value and that we don't currently have something that is capable of doing that, or there isn't a better way for us to do that. The fourth and final one is just, you got to lock in right now. And I hope every person and organization is in on this. Going back to my point on the backlash, it's not, are you in or are you out with AI? And that is probably one of my biggest risks that I want to call out as we hit this mid-year point, is that so many people are feeling like, I got to either cling to AI is cool and it is the thing, or boo, AI is bad and I hate it and I want to throw it out. And this tribal division in this, as the backlash is rising, is putting enormous pressure on people to feel like they have to fit into one of those two tribalistic camps. And that, I can assure you, that is not the best path. I am not going to say you can't go on one of those paths. I am a bit allergic to telling people you should or you shouldn't. But what I will tell you is that is not the best course of action. You need to understand these things and then make decisions intelligently about where does or where does not, where does AI make sense? Where does it not? Not do we use AI? Do we not use AI? And treating things like a monolith. That will not be the most effective path for anyone in any situation. And I know that might sound like a bold, broad stroke statement to make, but I can assure you that I have yet to see a situation where taking the tribal extreme of are you in or are you out with AI actually is the best path forward. The best path forward in every case I've encountered so far has been surgically understanding what you're doing and figuring out if and where AI makes sense, and then actually having objective measures for what success looks like, adapting and moving forward. Okay. That was a little bit longer than usual, but hopefully that gives you a feel for kind of where we were, where we are now. That sets a little bit of the trajectory. How people decide to act on those four things I laid out, I think, is going to largely influence what my podcast looks like at the end of 2026. And so I'm interested to see how things go, and I'm committed to doing absolutely everything I can to make sure that we get to the end of 2026 with a lot more wins than we're seeing right now. And they're out there. People are winning, but it definitely sometimes feels like it's the minority report. And so as we continue moving forward, if I can be of service to you, if I can help with that, please check out my website, reach out. I'm happy to collaborate and see how to help you better be one of the winning teams when it comes to this without having to feel like you have to choose one or the other. But with that, I hope you found this helpful, and we will see you on the other side.